Part 3. Real Black People.
I walked away from the Democrats because when did it become acceptable to encourage the assassination of the president, call for the physical assault of the president, demand the president's execution, call for the rape and murder of the president's child?
When I first discovered the Walkaway campaign, it seemed really obvious that the whole thing was an AstroTurf campaign, based on patterned behaviors myself and others were observing within their main Facebook group and the pages that pushed their content.
AstroTurf refers to apparently grassroots-based citizen groups or coalitions that are primarily conceived, created, and or funded by corporations, industry trade associations, political interests, or public relations firms.
And since the Walkaway campaign's primary objective appeared to be to manufacture the appearance of a viral exodus of people away from the Democratic Party to #walk away from it, it also seemed obvious that this was either a direct or indirect Republican Party operation. But journalist Carolyn Orr and a few others pointed out that the walkaway hashtag had been heavily amplified by Russian Twitter accounts, so there was that weird-ass Russia connection again.
Pro-Trump and Russia-linked Twitter accounts are posing as ex-Democrats in new AstroTurfed movement. #walk away from this deceptive propaganda campaign.
And I'd already concluded by the time I discovered Walkaway that it wasn't helpful to get sucked into Russiagate narratives, but Walkaway became intensely important for me in this bizarre journey I couldn't really go back from online, not because of who was behind it, and not actually because of it being an obvious influence operations campaign. What made it really important to me was that I watched it go from being an obviously fake campaign to something that was sort of real, and over time, I watched it actually reshape my thinking about identity politics entirely. So in the beginning, I was genuinely disgusted with the tactics I was watching the Walkaway cyber team use. They were using numerous hacked accounts, and there are ways to tell a Facebook account is hacked if you know what to look for. They posted pictures that looked like selfies. They were not just any selfies, like selfies of black people, trans people, gay people, and attached little confessional blurbs about why they were all abandoning the Democratic Party, liberalism, and identity politics, and instead embracing a more American nationalist kind of identity. America first, if you will. It felt like a new level of punching down on minority groups, because I knew that a lot of members of minority groups would see this stuff and trust the arguments coming from people like them and then align with these positions. But over time, I watched the Walkaway campaign start to attract Facebook accounts which were not hacked, they were not fake, and they were not bots. They were real accounts by real black people, real gay people, real women, and trans people, posting actual selfies, writing real #walkaway stories, and eventually posting video testimonies like the handful that I shared at the beginning of this video. As expected, these real posts got tons of engagement within Facebook and elsewhere. And as sick as this all felt, at least I got to feel clever, like I was in the know, because what an obvious case where
fake news is a weapon that works by infecting personal identity.
But then I was faced with something really difficult. A fair amount of the content in the Walkaway groups turned out to be content created far before the Walkaway campaign had ever existed. Viewpoints by black conservatives I'd just never heard of before. I'd literally never heard of such a thing as a black conservative, and my brain kind of went to well, these must be Russian bots, even though they're obviously real people. Ironically, going along with the liberal mantra of why allies just need to listen to and center marginalized voices, I kind of head-scratchingly started listening to black conservatives.
Some time ago, I met with a well-known TV newsman, and I asked him, why is it that when I look on television and I see what black spokesmen are saying, that I see them saying diametrically the opposite of what I hear in the black community, what I see in Gallup polls and other polls. For example, that blacks in this country support voucher systems 2-to-1. Blacks in this country prefer more strict enforcement of crime laws, are opposed to quota systems in employment or college admission, and have never had a majority in favor of busing. And yet when I look at the TV news, an entirely different world is created before my eyes on that tube. And he said to me, well, we can put Ben Hooks or Jesse Jackson on TV, but we can't put the Gallup poll on TV.
So everybody does identity politics. The left does it and the right does it. I think that since coming out as a conservative, the way I play identity politics is this. I'm black, I'm gay, I'm a Iraq War veteran, I'm all these different things, and they don't matter about my politics because I can be all of these things and still love America.
How does an African-American woman from Birmingham, Alabama, with a family background in church and arts become an academic expert and more than that, on the Soviet Union.
That's why I wanted to write this book. I say in order to know who I am and how I became who I am, you had to know John and Angelina Rice, my parents. And they simply believed that my horizons ought to be limitless. When I suddenly went home in college and said, Mom and Dad, I want to be a Soviet specialist, they said, well, that's good, dear. You go after it. And so I think it's really a story of not believing that there were limits of race and gender, despite the fact that in Birmingham, Alabama, there were clearly limits of race.
Tamir Rice was a black boy of about 12 who was brandishing a toy weapon, and he was shot dead. The exact same thing happened to a boy named Daniel Shaver not long after that. Daniel Shaver was white. Sam DuBose was shot dead by the police driving his car away from a cop. The exact same thing happened, actually a little bit before that, to a white guy named Andrew Thomas. Alton Sterling was a black man who reached into his waistband and reached for his wallet during an altercation with the cops, and the cops shot him dead. That was a grievous event. And the same thing actually happened around the same time to a white guy named Dylan Noble. Alton Sterling made national headlines. None of us heard about Dylan Noble.
We support Donald J. Trump! Yes! And we endorse Donald J. Trump!
But I find more often than not, society seems to be more focused on the mean things people say rather than realizing that a utopian society will never exist for as long as free will exists. And if I were to spend my days trying to censor people from saying hurtful things, I wouldn't get anything done, and it would probably turn me into a bitch. Bruh. Offensive or hurtful is 100% subjective, which is why it seems like the goalpost for political correctness is always moving. If something offends me, I'd rather suck it up and practice callousing my mind so that way I'm mentally prepared for when something actually traumatic happens.
But Black Americans, contrary to popular belief, can hold widely diverse and opposing opinions on political issues. Maybe Kanye is a Republican. I mean, he's never referred to himself as such, of course, but he said something about Trump that wasn't severely negative, so he's suddenly the Black Paul Ryan. But even if he is, so what? In fact, a 2012 study by Vincent Hutchins and Hakeem Jefferson using data from the American National Election Studies found that 45% of Black Americans identify as conservatives. Despite this, however, the Democratic Party typically receives 85 to 95% of the Black American vote.
The South is the only area for the most part in our country that still firmly believe in God. They're very conservative. Most of them are Republicans. And so the liberals, the Democrats don't want that, because you got to remember, folks, they're trying to defeat the Christians. They're trying to defeat the Republicans. They're not trying to help us. They're trying to wipe us out so that they can control everything.
So my first thoughts were, this must be internalized white supremacy, or these people have just been really brainwashed, or they're being paid a lot of money to say shit that they don't actually agree with. But the underlying assumption in my thoughts was that it's not possible, or maybe like not even allowed, for Black people to hold such views. Johnny Silvercloud wrote a piece last year called The White Anti-Racist Guide to Dealing with Black Conservatives, and his take is that Black conservatives serve as promoters of white supremacy and function as an actual trap for white liberals. They're a trap, he argues, because white liberals are expected to focus on their race instead of their arguments, which then positions white liberals as the real racists, which actually helps to bolster conservative and white supremacist arguments. And that's probably a sufficient enough analysis, although I have some critiques of that I won't go into here. But what became clear to me in my process of discovering, then really listening to Black conservatives for the first time, was that in a kind of ironic way, I did have this weird, like, racist, implicit bias problem of assuming that all Black people actually do think the exact same thing. So my appreciation for Black conservatism to this day isn't that I think their talking points have any particular merit due to, like, the Blackness of the people conveying the talking points, but the existence of Black conservatives actually challenges the falsehood of Black people being an ideological monolith. I think this is important for three reasons. One, Black people are not an ideological monolith. Two, identity groups in general are not ideological monoliths. And three, liberals make a lot of really bad bad and really stupid argument rooted within this exact assumption that identity groups are ideological monoliths. I'll elaborate more on what I mean about this in part 4. Another thing black conservatives helped me do was see black people and just people in general as more complex than I'd previously thought. Because as it turns out, a gay black man might think universal health care is a good idea and also might think that trans women aren't actually women. A trans woman might think that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to enter the United States and also that we need tighter gun control laws. Somehow I'd been taught for most of my life, especially in the time I spent on a college campus and while living in a college town, that people's identity categories defined the totality of who they were. And I wanted to get into this with my liberal friends, both on and offline, after entering into this territory, but I was actually really afraid because, well, I didn't mention this before, but all my liberal left friends knew me as the white guy who had taken multiple black studies classes in college and led reading groups with other white people with the book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, as somebody who did tons of outreach for a local effort to make ethnic studies mandatory in high schools, and the white ally resume list kind of goes on from there, but the point is that it would have seemed really f***ing outlandish for me to start suddenly questioning identity politics. But what I decided to do instead of questioning liberal and identity politics was I started a sort of art and education project by making a photo album on my real Facebook account with screenshots that I'd taken from the world of right-wing Facebook. I made clear that these were examples of what I had seen and learned about in the roughly 6 months I'd spent on the so-called other side of the internet, and I just wanted people whose algorithms didn't even let them know this shit existed to suddenly be able to see it and understand it and think about it. At the very least, I argued, if we understand our enemy's way of thinking, as well as the ways that digital influence operations work, we might better understand how to improve our own strategies on how to make the world a better place. A small handful of friends did find this fascinating or just kind of shocking or disturbing, and they said so, but the loudest voices in my kind of liberal left community, the ones that kind of lead the public shaming brigades in liberal internet world, they argued that simply by displaying these kinds of views, by forcing them into their news feeds, that I was causing them and others like them serious trauma and suffering, that I was doing violence against vulnerable people. And these are the people whose comments always got liked and loved and responded to, and so those comments got boosted into other people's news feeds, and you kind of know what happens from there. And I kind of dissociated from the entire process. I just watched the shallow liberal ideology work its magic through the algorithms without other liberals understanding how the algorithms were actually controlling the conversation from that point forward. And I tried my best not to feel deeply hurt when these people and their followers blocked and unfriended me, but man, that really does hurt when you think of such people as being your friend. What happened next was when I'd unplug from the matrix of liberal left Facebook and I'd plug back into the matrix of right-wing Facebook, I felt sort of identified with some of the right-wingers, almost a sense of camaraderie, because I actually kind of understood what they meant by the so-called tolerant left. But like I said in part 1 of this video, I literally fled my own family of origin because they were like, "Shut up and pray, child," whenever I tried to approach them with any good faith questions about anything. But now it started to feel like that's exactly how liberals were too. So now I felt torn between worlds. Conservatives were obviously wrong, but so were liberals. I was alone. I felt like I had nowhere to go, no family or home to return to. I had no choice but to walk away, walk away.